Hey there folks, Tim Slade here, and welcome back to the ATD Ask a Trainer video series. In today's episode, my special guest Carla Torgerson and I are answering your questions about designing microlearning. So let's jump into it. You know, one of the things I know to be true about our industry is its love for buzzwords. You know, every couple of years there's a new thing that seems to dominate the conversation, and it usually leads to a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. And I happen to believe that microlearning is one of these buzzwords that haphazardly gets thrown around a lot. What is it? What should you use it for? How long should it be? These are all questions that everyone seems to have a different answer for. So today I decided to invite an expert on microlearning to help me tackle these questions. So let's get to it. All right. Hey, Carla, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Great, thanks. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing awesome. So tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what you do for a living, and all that good stuff.
Sure, great. Thanks so much. Well, I currently lead learning experience strategy at Torrance Learning. We are a firm that helps to connect strategy to design, development, data, and then ultimately performance. But I have a long history both with ATD and in the instructional design space. I've been an instructional designer for pretty close to 20 years, working at a couple of different firms and also in large organizations. And I know you from our work with ATD. I've been involved with ATD for, almost 15 years now.
Oh, wow.
Teaching classes for them. I've got a book with them, some fun stuff like that.
Yeah, we, I don't know if this was officially the first time we met, but how we came about, I guess, knowing each other was a little bit odd. I don't remember, what conference was it that we met each other at?
Was that Technology maybe a year ago?
It might have been Technology. It might have been ICE. I don't know. It was one of the many conferences, but I know we were having, everyone was taking their box lunches outside, and I noticed you were standing there. And at the time, I had just started facilitating the microlearning certificate program, which ATD offers, that I know you designed. And so I thought, I'll connect with you. And that's how I think that's how we first officially met.
And I remembered seeing you there, and I was like, hey, I know Tim. I heard he's going to be involved in this program. I should go say hello. So it was like two magnets coming together.
Yeah. Well, I'm so happy to have you join us today because in at least from my standpoint, you're kind of like the expert of microlearning, not only because you helped design the ATD microlearning certificate program, but I know you also, within the last year, you published a book with ATD on microlearning. Is that correct?
I did. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning it. It's called Designing Microlearning. It's with the ATD Press. My co-author is Sue Iannone.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
And it's just filled with all kinds of tips and tricks for going micro, some job aids, and really practical advice as well.
That's awesome. All right. Well, so are you ready to get some questions or answer some questions with me?
I would love it. That'd be fun.
All right. Let's get to our first question. Okay. So our first question comes from Razina Bakshi, and I apologize, Razina, if I didn't get your name right. And Razina wants to know, what is the ideal length of microlearning? And I think this is a great place to start this episode with this question, because I think this is the number one question I think most folks have, or there's the most misunderstanding on when it comes to microlearning, is how long or how short should a microlearning be? So what are your thoughts on that, Carla?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me personally, I think that our space is really muddy when we talk about microlearning. And I think it's because a lot of people are doing different things and always still calling it microlearning. So I actually like to think of microlearning broken down into 4 key areas. And when you do that, then the seat time is actually different for each. So for me personally, I like to think of microlearning in these 4 ways, right? The first one is pre-work, or something to prepare people for a longer learning experience, whether it's in a classroom or a VILT or something like that. And the second one is when we do something after long form learning. We usually call that boost learning or reinforcement, right? And then the third one is the standalone microlearning that people get excited about, just a single module or a series of modules in a portal that people can select from. And then the fourth one is performance support. And that gets you into just-in-time learning, workflow learning, things like that. And for me personally, when I go to conferences or talk to people, and they say they're going micro, or it's a vendor talking about doing micro learning, they're doing one of those four, but it's always something different, right? And so to me, when you think of it in those four ways, then the seat time debate or question becomes so much clearer, right?
Sure.
So when it's pre-work, you could potentially be, I think, up to about 10 minutes, read this case study, answer a few questions. If it's for after long form instruction, that's your second one. In boost learning, the research from Art Cohen says you can be as short as 30 seconds and it's equally effective to something that's longer, even as long as 5 minutes. So again, shorter is much, much better there. Yeah. In the third one, in the standalone microlearning, I actually think of it as whether we're doing informal learning or formal learning, I think you've got a little bit of play there, but often I go with somewhere between about 4 and 8 minutes. And then when you do the fourth one, the performance support, it actually gets very specific to what's the use case, right? If it is workflow learning, it's being used right when they're doing that job, then it could be as short as 30 seconds, right? Something you can use at a glance. If it's just in time training that you're stopping work for a few minutes to do that work, do that training and then go back to work, maybe you might jump up to like 5 or 6 minutes or something like that. So I think overall people are aiming for somewhere between 0 and 30 seconds and 10 minutes, but it really depends on what you're doing and what the use case is.
Yeah, I love that framework of those 4 things. And we'll answer another question that's, I think we'll bring this up, but it's about making it fit for function for what you're trying to accomplish and where you're using the learning. And there used to be, at least when I started in the world of e-learning, there's a common question of how long or how short should an e-learning course be. And it used to be something crazy, like no longer than 45 minutes. And then it became 30 minutes and then it became 20 minutes. And now people say, oh, e-learning shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. And I've just never been a big fan of like putting arbitrary durations of time on learning, because learning takes as long as it takes. But I do like the framework of, how are you using the microlearning, whether it's to support long form training or is it performance support, and what are you trying to accomplish with it? And then, determine the length that's most appropriate for that learning experience.
Yeah. And to your point, it also depends very much on the content, right? Like oftentimes microlearning is just a type of e-learning.
Yeah.
And if that really is it, then to your point, the seat time's kind of an arbitrary question as well, right? It's what works for the learner and meets their needs best.
And I think one of the things we should clarify, even though I don't think we have a question on this today, one of the misconceptions I think there is that microlearning is just a form of e-learning. Microlearning, yes, it could be e-learning, but it also could be a job aid, a video, an article, a blog, right? So it could be any of those things.
Agreed. 100%. Yeah. I've even seen people go micro in stand-up training. It's very rare and very hard, but you can do it if you're wanting to.
I guess you consider, like, if you're just doing, a 5-minute coaching session with somebody, that could be a form of microlearning. Yeah.
And I know of some people who started putting their organization did weekly huddles with the team, and she would develop a short 5-minute lesson for the manager to share at their huddle once a month.
I love that.
That's microlearning.
All right. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Rosina, for asking that question. And those are great insights, Carla. All right. So our second question comes from Stephanie Hobelman. I apologize again if I'm getting your last name wrong. And Stephanie wants to know how many topics should be covered in a micro-learning resource. That's a really great question. Carla, what do you think on that?
Yeah, it is a really great question. Most people say one learning objective, and I think that's probably where I would focus my attention, is on the single learning objective. Now, I think the other question is, again, what's your purpose and who's your audience? If you have kind of this little bucket of information or content that needs to be addressed, perhaps it's teaching somebody how to do a particular task in a piece of software. That task could have multiple steps, right? Or having a difficult conversation with a coworker who gets angry easily, right? That's a nice compact topic for a piece of e-learning, but there's a lot packed in there, right? Like having difficult conversations, personality style of the person you're talking to, so I think it's about having like that one topic, one thing you're focused on, And then, people say, 3 to 5 talking points. I found sometimes I have a little more, but again, it's really about thinking about what would be the right amount for the learner to fully understand that concept, in a concise way.
Yeah, I love that. I think whenever I talk about microlearning, the number one reason I think a lot of learning professionals are interested in microlearning is because they have stakeholders or subject matter experts who mistakenly believe that you're going to take what, originally took maybe a full day in a workshop or even half a day in a workshop or a couple hours in a workshop and condense it into a 10-minute thing, right? When in reality, I don't, and I think you would agree with this, microlearning is not about condensing content. It's about chunking content, right? And so I think one of the misconceptions people have when they talk about how much to cover in microlearning, it's not about taking those 10 topics that you took an hour to teach and making them 5 minutes. Maybe it's breaking those 10 topics into multiple resources.
Absolutely. And when you broke those 10 topics into those multiple resources, maybe you found out that 2 of them really weren't so important anymore.
Yep,
right. So
absolutely.
so there's this sense of like prioritizing, but
Yeah.
I agree, it's not about condensing, because, before we all came up with this great word called microlearning, it wasn't that we were highly inefficient learners and now all of a sudden I can learn an hour's worth of content in 10 minutes. That
Sure.
didn't happen.
Yep.
If the depth is important, you still need longer form instruction. And if that depth can be scaled back, or we can break it apart into chunks, that's where the microlearning can come in for us.
Good. Yeah, I love that. All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hopefully that helps answer that question. All right, so our third question comes from Karthik Richard. Hey, Karthik. And Karthik wants to know, how do you calculate the impact and ROI of microlearning? Gosh, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Carla, but talking about measuring e-learning and ROI is not one of my favorite topics. And part of the reason is because I think a lot of organizations talk about measuring learning. I rarely see organizations actually do a good job measuring it, and B, end up doing anything with the information. Or with the data. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Carla?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think our industry is challenged by the ROI question always, right?
Mm-hmm.
And microlearning is no different. Where I think microlearning can have value in that question, though, is that if you are talking especially about performance support and getting closer to that moment of performance, Bob Mosier and Con Godfredson talk a lot about how within that space, when you're as closer to the moment of performance, you can actually get better correlation, right? Like if somebody took this, they became faster at this, right? They did the task. They took the training, they did the task better. They used the performance support, they were more capable, less errors, whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas if you take a class and then 30 days later, so much happens in that space. It's really hard for us to assign a value there. Now, I'm not poo-pooing all the great work that folks like the Phillips and the Kirkpatricks are doing in that space. But I do think it's a challenging question.
Yeah.
And so what I like to do is with microlearning, either get as close to the moment of performance as possible, because then the data that I'm collecting can be correlated to performance a little bit more easily.
Sure.
Or I look a lot, at usage data. So, for example, I've got a great story of a piece we did actually years ago before it was ever called microlearning. And we had a piece that we gave to sales reps. It was really a job aid, and they were to use it in selling situations. And what we found was that there was a group of people who used it 1,000 times or more. Well, I can tell you that people voted with their clicks, right, Tim? Yep. That, they wouldn't have gone back to using it 1,000 times if it didn't help them.
Yep.
Right. So I think there's power there, even though it's not the only story I want to tell is the usage data. It certainly gives me something.
Well, what I love about that is I don't think we always think about measuring usage when it comes to, the everyday standard forms of learning, like instructor-led or even, e-learning on a LMS, because usually it usually is assigned and required, or it's some sort of compliance. But with performance support, microlearning, those tend to be more informal, and so usage, I think does make sense. It's probably more informative than even doing like a level 1 evaluation on satisfaction. I guess usage is ultimately the one that tells you whether or not it's helpful or not, and people are satisfied with it.
I would agree 100%. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for that question, Karthik, and hopefully that helped. All right, so our next question comes from Amira Sammy, and Amira wants to know, when should I be using microlearning? Now, Carla, I think this probably goes back to the 4 use cases you were mentioning earlier when we were talking about how long microlearning should be. So can you remind us of those 4 things a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So the first one there is preparation or pre-work, so getting ready for a longer form learning like a class or a virtual instructor-led training. The second time is for after that long form instruction, usually called boost learning. Mm-hmm. The third one is standalone microlearning. So those are those small bits that you might put in a portal, or maybe a single piece that you just require people to take from the LMS. And then the fourth one is performance support, supporting them really on the job. And so to me, those are the 4 different places where you can use micro. And I think when you think of it that way, it also broadens our horizons a little bit. And instead of looking at a curriculum and going, we should be able to go micro somewhere in here, that this is your opportunity to say, oh, that's where or how I can use micro, and it's going to blend in with some other things I'm going to do as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back to determining what do you want to achieve with the learning experience, and then designing a fit for function solution that might incorporate microlearning or something else, or blend into it, right? So I think it's not about just arbitrarily deciding, e-learning or instructor-led training or job aid. It's about looking at what you're trying to achieve and how those different pieces fit together.
Absolutely. And just being really thoughtful about it.
Yep. Well, good. Awesome. Well, I hope that helps, Amira, and thanks for submitting that question. All right, so our final question comes from Taylor Henshaw. Hey, Taylor. And Taylor wants to know, what role can microlearning play in large-scale training? And I like this question a lot, and I think it kind of goes back to the 4 use cases we were talking about earlier, Carla. And the reason why I like this question is because, at least in my experience, whenever somebody starts a new learning project, someone eventually asks or wonders, should this be an instructor-led training? Should it be microlearning? Or they'll say, should this be a job aid, or should it be a video? And I've never been a big fan of asking those questions, because it assumes that creating learning or creating training is a binary choice between one thing or another. When in reality, I think you would agree that learning should be a blend of experiences. And back to our previous question, making it fit for function for what you're trying to achieve. And so what I really like about this question that Taylor asks is, how can microlearning fit as part of a blended approach to training? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So what I love about Taylor's question is, that idea of focusing on skill development really does require reinforcement and practice, right? You don't learn a new skill in one time. Yep. And so I think when we go there, then we can see multiple uses for microlearning, right? Whether it's that we have a class where we teach them how to do this thing, and so we then use boost learning where, over the next 30 days, we're giving them little prompts and reminders, or that maybe it's a skill that they can learn through performance support or just-in-time training, right? Just on the job. We're going to help them while they're trying to do the task. It's a combination of those, right? But I do think that big skills and large scale development, which Taylor was asking about, can certainly be enhanced with microlearning. But I don't think that would be your probably not your only play, right? You've probably got a number of things going on there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all that, and I think it used to be when learning styles were still a thing. I think people tried to pair the training modality with the learning style, which is, as we all know now, is not right. It's more about, what's the most appropriate way to teach the skill? Is it something somebody needs to see? Well, maybe that's a video. Or is it something somebody needs to practice? Well, maybe that's a simulation or something they do on the job or in the classroom. And so figuring out, can you teach the skill in a micro format way? And is it the right thing for teaching that skill or reinforcing it, or whatever you're doing with it? I think that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, really thinking about what the skill or task is, right? Like I
Yeah.
used to do a lot of work in healthcare and, teaching somebody to draw blood, right? A nurse to do that work, right? Certainly that is not typical job skill training, right? They do that in colleges, but still there's a lot to that. It's a single small skill. And you can do part of that by, say, a video showing it.
Sure.
But some of it is tactile and they have to just get in there and practice as well with a coach and stuff like that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. Okay, great question, Taylor, and hopefully we were able to provide some helpful insights. All right, so those are all of our questions, and I want to thank you so much for joining us, Carla. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Tim. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to find me. LinkedIn.com/in/Carla Torgerson. I post content there fairly regularly. And if they're interested in the book, again, it's called Designing Microlearning from ATD Press.
Perfect, and we'll put those links down in the description. All right, thank you so much, Carla. It was great having you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It was really fun spending some time with you today.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. First, I want to thank Carla for joining us, and as always, a big thanks to everyone who submitted questions for this month's episode. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to get alerted when we publish our next episode of Ask a Trainer, click that subscribe button below and make sure to check out the ATD Ask a Trainer advice column by clicking on the link in the description. My name is Tim Slade, and until next month, I will see you around. Bye!